All right, I'm Tommy Pearce, Executive Director of Neighborhood Nexus down in Atlanta. I'm going to moderate this next panel on civic journalism. We've got a couple of main objectives for this conversation. We're going to talk about collaborating between civic journalism and civic data intermediaries like us, everyone's favorite kind of nonprofit. And I will say at first, we're slightly abbreviating the live conversation because April is sick. So Cole spent some time with her earlier. They recorded a 10-minute video that she'll answer the same questions right after us. So we'll do live, then video, then Q&A. What could go wrong? All right, so like I said, we're going to talk about collaborations between civic journalism, civic data intermediaries, and we'll also use investor housing as kind of a case study as a way to frame this so you can see it in action. So I'll let y'all kind of briefly introduce yourselves.
My name is Mike Vickers. I'm a data analyst at Data Driven Detroit, and I've been working with Sarah and Outlier, others from Outlier on a project on investor-owned housing in the city.
Hi, my name is Sarah Alvarez. I'm the founder and the editor-in-chief of Outlier Media here in Detroit, and we are a service-based journalism organization. We fill information, accountability, and connection gaps in that order.
Cool. Last year I was really proud of myself. I took Twitter off my phone and I subscribed to my local paper.
Good.
So I get it physically in the mail twice a week. Super happy about it. But I also kind of have a hunch that might not be exactly what civic journalism is. It might be local media. And so we wanted to kind of start by framing the conversation, like what counts as nonprofit, civic, local journalism, and there's probably some sort of Venn diagram, but Sarah, if you don't mind kind of explaining, what counts?
I think my definition here is pretty broad. I think that any local media that is really trying to advance the interests of the community is civic journalism. There are more nonprofit newsrooms now than I think ever before, but it's a really young field. Some of the oldest nonprofit newsrooms are like not quite 20 years old. And I don't think being a nonprofit news organization necessarily means that it's a high quality news organization, just like being a for-profit news organization doesn't mean that that's a low-quality information source. But I think civic journalism is high quality, is centered on residents' needs, and is centered on accountability and like having a functioning environment for the residents of that place.
Great, thank you. We want to get to the collaboration, but part of this is, understanding, well, what's the need or what's in it for each of these sides of that partnership. I know in Atlanta, we've worked with Canopy Atlanta, which they have a documenters program. They train residents to do journalism about their community. Our deepest relationship, I think if organizations can have best friends, ours is a civic journalism group called Atlanta Civic Circle. They're like the college buddy that when you show up to our office, they're sometimes having meetings on our couch. So we're very close. They sneak into our offices. I'm wondering, like, if you could talk about what are the what are the data needs of journalism groups, as a way for us to understand how can we help or how can we support these organizations like yours?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a different landscape in terms of news organizations and the resources that news organizations have available to them when compared to even a few years ago. The news industry continues to shrink. And that means that a lot of newsrooms that had their own data department no longer really have that. And it also means there's a big difference between the few newsrooms that are able to have a data department and the majority of newsrooms which don't have anybody who really does data work exclusively. Or, there's always going to be a couple of journalists who feel comfortable with data, but maybe are not they don't have a data editor. Right, or their ability to really do like high-powered data investigations, data-driven investigations is pretty low. The other thing I will say about this is that, for all of the shit that we get, journalists. There's this baby in this room can't hear that. They don't care. They're too little.
Stephanie said it's cool.
Yeah. So all of the, the grief that we get, journalists and newsrooms take their jobs really seriously and take conflict of interest really seriously. And that means, like, as we have smaller newsrooms and fewer resources, we have a hard time figuring out who we can work with. We are not able to work with most people because it's a conflict for us. We can't work with the city. We're going to need to hold them accountable. We can't work very closely with most, advocacy. We can't work with advocacy organizations closely. We're going to need to be able to hold them accountable. I think it's a very rare partnership with these kind of organizations that we probably can work together very closely. Sure, we may need to hold Data-Driven Detroit accountable if they aren't, if they start acting out. No, I'm just kidding. But it seems like that's less likely. And also we can enter into a contract position with a group like that much more easily than we can with another group. So but even these partnerships, I think, are best when they are contracts, when the lines of communication are clear, when the power is clear, and when the relationship is clear. Because again, journalists and newsrooms are under more scrutiny than ever, and so we want to be able to show that we have really bright lines around how we interact with any other group.
Thank you. Nikolai has heard me say this a million times, but I always talk about how much time we spend building dashboards and data tools, and then the rest of our time figuring out why no one's using them. And I think the story and the story element really helps add the human element. I think similar, and let Mike give you some time to talk, is what conditions have to be true in order for us to have kind of a healthy, successful, impactful partnership between journalism groups, data intermediaries, or whatever flavor of each of those.
Well, so I think when we were talking over who was going to jump on for this panel to talk through, I think the reason that my flag started to lift was because when we were talking about our collaboration, I was like, I don't think we quite figured this out yet. I think we're still struggling to figure exactly how this relationship should work and how we can best deliver what we know we're really good at to help you do what you all are trying to do. I think for a lot of the clients that we work with, we're trying to help people guide investment and guide strategy, like it says on the NNIP mission. And the quality of, well, it's not the quality necessarily, but you can deliver a data set and you can say, here's a really good piece of evidence for the decision you're trying to make. Here is a huge list of caveats that you should be aware as you're going through this process of making this decision. That's much more difficult when you're trying to fit that into a news story in which somebody's trying to communicate that data quickly and efficiently and make sure people are understanding kind of the thread of what's being described here. And so that was, I think, for us, something where we don't quite know. We're learning. I think we're getting better, but don't know how to package what we deliver to Outlier to say, yeah, here's what we found from the investigation, from the question that you're asking. We can deliver this. We can maybe deliver this at different levels to say, you want to answer this question. We can answer this really with a lot of certainty. This is kind of starting to get into a gray area. But figuring out exactly how our processes work to best help you all has been a learning process. But I think we're getting somewhere.
Yeah, I think to pitch collaborating with newsrooms, I think we are the best possible partner. Let me also say that we are the worst possible partner. It's totally true. But I think that when we can get it right, and I feel confident that we will, we're both going to have a much better product, right? Journalists, we're pains in the ass because we're always we want more answers, and we want the newest information. But the reason why is because we are really trying to fill information and accountability gaps that really exist. So to that infrastructure question that you had in the previous panel of how do you make people care about maintenance and infrastructure needs, you don't make them care. They do care. A lot of news organizations don't necessarily tell that story, right? But if you're really locked into people's needs, obviously infrastructure matters a ton. That's actually what people want to talk about. That's what they want answers about. So I think that these collaborations But a lot of newsrooms, like we were talking about before, don't necessarily have the resources to understand how to tell those stories well, or like where those pain points are, whatever. So like these kind of collaborations I think can really serve the city, but it does take working through these data questions like really carefully.
Yeah, I think beyond the programmatically, like it just makes sense. And because of the conversation we just had, I feel like at least where we're from in Atlanta, we work well together with our civic journalists because we've trauma bonded over not having any resources to do anything. And so together we can, we have that kind of shared experience, but we have the mission alignment and everything like y'all have talked about. I want to switch a little bit to kind of the case study, just to show like what does this look like in action. And I know in Atlanta, since the Great Recession, I was just reading some stuff from one of our partners at Georgia Tech last night. Wall Street investors have bought homes in the city of Atlanta at a 37% discount, which I thought was really interesting. Like you expect they're just paying more in cash, but they aren't. Contributing to neighborhoods in the city of Atlanta losing out on $1.25 billion in equity or wealth. That's just in the last 10 to 15 years, and obviously even that is unevenly distributed across neighborhoods. This is an issue across our country, especially in the urban areas that we all work in. I'm just curious to know, what does this look like for y'all, and how has it informed your work, and what is some of the work that y'all are doing together?
So we do a lot of work around information needs to plan our beats, to decide what we report on, and housing has been Detroiters' number one information and accountability need since 2016, when I started Outlier. Detroit, I don't know if you guys have already talked about this earlier. Have you guys talked about the housing market in Detroit already today?
Not in a lot of depth.
It's wild. It's insane. We have had a lot of big events here that spanned several years, right? We had, of course, the mortgage foreclosure crisis, which everybody had all over the country, but here it was exacerbated by overassessment by the city of Detroit to the tune of $600 million. Check out Christine McDonald's work at the Detroit News for that. And then a tax foreclosure auction that took homes and auctioned them off at a pretty fast clip for several years. And that means that investors were able to buy homes extremely cheaply with almost no oversight. And the housing stock here has just turned over several times in the last couple of years. And the business model of a lot of those speculators has been to put as little money into the homes as possible and then resell them or just sit on them and do land swaps with the city or another big buyer. One of the speculators that I spoke to several years ago who owns at one time owned more than 1,000 properties in Detroit was like, well, the tax auction won't last forever and they won't be a bulk seller, but we want to be that bulk seller so that when private equity is interested in buying up lots of homes, we can be that seller to them. So that's what's going on here. And also Detroit is a cash market almost exclusively, right? So more than 70% of Detroiters buy their homes completely in cash. That's at the low end of the market in particular, not at the bidding war high end of the market. And that means that Detroiters are extremely vulnerable to scams and those kind of things because there's not banks watching the investment and making sure it appraises, making sure the title's clear, all that stuff. So that's to say, information and high quality information on ownership, on title, on tax debt, on all of those things is incredibly important, and it's not going to be helpful if you write a story about it. So you need to be able to get that information to people one-on-one. We have a text message system that has all the property information for people, and they can use it to look up any address. But that's also to say that's why now that we're out of kind of the real estate has started to transfer, we believe, a little bit less quickly, and also maybe between, would you say this right? Between fewer people, right? Like the transactions are like more concentrated.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. It's definitely going slower from the data that I've looked at this morning.
Good job.
In the last year, on like if you do like an average weekly basis, it's fallen off this year. But yeah.
And so we're like past this crisis point where like most people just like need to know like how much tax debt is on this place, like am I going to lose my home, who really owns it, right? Like that is still really important for a lot of people, but we're now at the point where we need to be able to say like, what has happened? Like, how has this shaken out? Like, who owns all of this property now? Like, what have those years of tax foreclosure and those auctions and this, again, like very little oversight by the county and city, what has that meant for the city at large? I do want to shout out, like, I know Josh Akers is here because I saw him standing up. There he is. So Josh has also, used to be here in the city and started a project called Property Praxis, which really looked at investor ownership and of all of the properties here in the city and who owns all of those LLCs that register properties. So he's done like years and years and years of really important work on speculation. I just want to like shout it out. Josh is super helpful, and we use it as a resource. Yeah, so we have to untangle this, and we cannot do it unless we can figure out who owns what, and that is what we contracted with D3 to help us understand, and it is so hard, and if we can, like I feel like there's more people working on that issue here in Detroit than there are in most places because it's happened here first and it happened at a scale that a lot of us like started keeping track many, many years ago. So if we can't quite get it right, that means that everybody else is very far behind. And we really need to know this in order to help residents in all of in places like Atlanta and smaller cities to really figure out like, how much power do they have when it comes to their actual built environment? Anything you want to
Mike,
add?
you want to build up from the data side?
From the data side, I would say that when we started this project, like I've been familiar out with Outlier for a while, and I've read some of it, but what I did find really once we'd done a couple iterations of getting data sets out, like kind of going to everybody's reporting and reading all as much as I could for a long time about it, and realizing like, it's almost like if you're thinking like middle school scientific method, like this is so much observation here, that when you come to data and we come and we start to ask these questions on this big data set where I have hundreds of thousands of rows, it starts to give you that like a strategy to approach it, which if we could do this over again, it would be, I think, utilizing all of that information gathered over a really long time to then when we sit down at my SQL terminal and say like, okay, how am I actually going to start looking at these things, the subtleties that I should be thinking about, having that really informed by like that kind of observational step that's done at that like very close level, working with people, hearing their stories, hearing the things that, the government processes they're interacting with. So, because that's ultimately which generate a lot of the data sets that I'm looking at ultimately, like how can you develop strategies that kind of start there and then move towards data and then move back into reporting. Like I think there's a lot of potential there as we practice this and get good at these collaborations. A lot of potential there. So,
what if like the deliverables or products look like? Is it a series of stories? Is it a data tool, or are they like kind of reference each other?
What we want is what we really need. What we really want is the ability to look at to look at Detroit as a whole and to say what has the impact of speculation been in the city. How many properties right now are owned by real estate speculators? We have our own definition for that, but it doesn't just necessarily mean like corporate ownership. It really means like speculation, right, which we see as more of a harm. So we need to understand the amount of property in the city that is owned by those folks. We can, without like the help of somebody like D3, do a pretty good job figuring out like on a one speculator, like if we're trying to understand somebody's portfolio and we know about them because they get sued a lot, because we hear about them all the time, like that we can do a pretty good job. But what we cannot do is like figure out like, what is that a bigger part of? We know, but we can't back it up. We cannot say like, this is the degree to which like people outside of the city own, this much property in Detroit.
And this is one of those data points where we can get you an answer with 2 pages of caveats and a pretty big like error bar on it, and that's really hard. Like that's really
yeah, and that's like not what people want.
Yeah.
Because it's really like, I think that the other thing that our partnership over the years has been really helpful at is that like, those. Of course that data work and those error bars and all of that, like it is really important, but that's also like where the accountability goes to die, right? Like that allows people to kind of say like, well, I'm not sure if it's 100% right. Like, oh, well, in this case, that might not be true. And if what we're really trying to do is create accountability, we really need as much certainty as possible so that people can't really like wiggle out from their responsibility. So that is why like we're always kind of pushing on like, yeah, but what's the real number? What's the real number? What's the real number?
I think it'd be cool if Mike had a weekly column of just caveats. That would sell papers. One of the huge value adds that we see is with kind of the storytelling and the human side, and then the data behind it providing evidence, is that it becomes more actionable, right? And I think that's I'm going to keep leaning into the philanthropy conversation because I want to attract their attention. But like when you add the components together to become greater than the parts, I think that's where civic journalism and civic data intermediaries come together to like create that more actionable information that has the human context. I mean, have you all kind of seen that to be true here around the housing issues?
What do you think? You tell me.
I don't know. I mean, the housing issue in Detroit is
Everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's been evolving a lot over the last decade. It's gone through, data has always, I don't know, after reading those reports, I do feel like from a lot of the technique from like reports that I've read in newspapers, it's like doing direct, like, we're gonna look at the records of this parcel, which I was talking to someone earlier about how like, okay, we have the full data set. The way that picture that you can go on the county website and get every document related to that parcel, it doesn't translate directly to what you see in the data set. Occasionally it gets as bad as like the text is just ran over all the fields that you get in your spreadsheet, and you have to try to account for, okay, there was something there, but like clearly this is garbage on this place. So so as far as, I think we would really love to tell that full picture, right? But what we can do is really get down to like really small pieces at a time that we can get into really clear detail, right? Or you can try to step back and tell the full picture, and then you kind of get this blurry, where you may know what's going on broadly, but it's really hard to get to like, a single number that you can stand behind. So it's always played a role, but it would be really nice if we could.
Yeah, and I think that the storytelling element of it is actually like not the most powerful part of what we do. I think that the most powerful part of what we do is get people the information that they need to meet their challenges and achieve their goals. And often that is at like the property level, right? Like, so it's not that we need another story about how the tax foreclosure auction upended life in Detroit. What people need to know is, was I overassessed? And what am I gonna do about it? Has my property been owned by these different people? And what does that mean for me? Does that mean I have more risk than I believed, right? Like, those are the things that people actually really need. And we can make, we bring people in with stories, but what we really want to be able to offer them is like very specific information that helps them understand these larger narratives that are always swirling and are not just by news organizations, right? This story of like Detroit is, Detroit is a stronger city than ever, right? Like, people need to be able to figure out, like, is that true for me? Like, we need to offer them information that they can use to kind of decide how these larger narratives apply to them, and which ones of these larger narratives they believe, and how they want to like support these larger narratives, I think.
I'm not sure how to segue into now we're going to watch a 10-minute video of someone answering the same questions, but we have, yeah, okay, that was it. that was very clever. So go for it. April Urban from Cleveland is a video of her talking to Cole earlier today while she's sick, so she gets extra credit for that.
All right, so the first question I'll ask is just to describe what Signal Cleveland and how it works, and some of the data staff that you have on hand.
Sure. Signal Cleveland is a new nonprofit model for local news. We are attempting to build a way of serving a community with nonprofit news that's built off of the Documenters program and network. So with the Documenters program, we pay and train. We also often call it a civic side hustle. We train and pay regular people to attend government meetings. And whenever they attend a meeting, they also note questions that they have about the meeting. So in addition to learning all that they learn about what's going on in their local government through that meeting, they take notes, record so anybody else can access and see the notes from that meeting, and they ask questions about it. So at the heart of our goal is taking their questions and merging that with our coverage. So making sure we're always reflecting what the Cleveland community wants to know about their local government and other institutions. And then we just want to generally be more reflective of the Cleveland community. Instead of, you can think of some of the harm that media has done over the past X number of years, where communities like Cleveland were only covered in the news in negative ways. We want to flip that script to being more embedded in the community, covering what they're interested in, and a better reflections, not just negative, of the community itself.
Got it. Awesome. Yeah, I think that's yeah, a lot of good detail to sort of flesh out what community journalism looks like in practice. Okay. And then I think the panel will have already talked about investor housing some, but Signal published a story detailing a series of transactions that occurred on the east side of Cleveland with a network of involving, a network of Swedish investors. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that and what you all found from that piece.
Sure. Really, about a year ago, folks in Sweden, a news media outlet in Sweden, got in touch with us because Swedish investors who had been convinced to buy, who had bought properties in Cleveland, were then suing the entity that that made that connection to them. How can I say that more succinctly? Okay.
We can edit this out.
Yeah. Cut. All right. So about a year ago, a news media outlet in Sweden got in touch with us. A company called Solid Capital Group had connected a bunch of investors in Sweden, Swedish investors, to properties in Cleveland. And those investors were suing Solid Capital Group. And the news media outlet knew that they wanted to have some eyes and ears on the ground in looking into their story. When we first kind of spoke with them about it, I thought, oh my goodness, tale as old as time. That maybe other folks in the NNIP room might relate to that too. Like we've been kind of telling the story of investors out of town, especially out of town investors swooping in and having no idea what they're purchasing in Cleveland, and properties ultimately declining as a result. But when we started to pair together Nick Castell's his reporting, essentially his interviews with SBAR Holdings, that's the entity that is not actually local to Cleveland, but was finding and acquiring properties in Cleveland and then selling them to the investors that Solid Capital Group curated. So in the combination of his reporting, his multiple interviews with everybody involved gave, I thought, this really cool 360 picture of what this issue looks like for one entity. And then we started to see that come together on the data side too, when we are able to just focus on this one particular network. We were able to see, okay, they're able to buy properties at this amount, flip them for a $30,000 profit on average each. And then we were even able to follow them further down the line and look at, for the Swedish investors who've sold their properties, what were they able to sell it for? And so, we saw that bump up from SBAR buying the property low, selling high, and then that bump back down. So I think, it was just a real interesting and concrete way to connect this issue to the average Clevelander or the average person who might not be thinking about, they may or may not even be aware that people buy properties in bulk in this way, right? That might be new information to the average person. And so to be able to explain what has happened with one particular network in detail, I thought was really new and actually very helpful in helping build an on-the-ground understanding of that phenomenon.
Definitely. Yeah. That's really important work, and we'll definitely direct people to that story. So thank you for going over that. And then the last question we had was if you have any sort of recommendations or best practices or things that both civic journalists and data intermediaries should keep in mind when they're doing collaborations with each other.
Yeah, I got very excited when Kathy kind of reached out with the kernel of the idea about how NNIP Partners and journalism can partner more. That thought's very exciting to me. I do feel like very new in the space still. So all of my ideas can be taken with a grain of salt for sure. But I really feel like we're at Signal well positioned to engage with folks in community. We've started, and that can be helpful to NNIP Partners. So that's sort of one way that I've been thinking about. We've been experimenting with something we're calling data dives, where we reach out, we just open our doors and say, come on in, we're going to talk about this topic. We recently did our second data dive on the work we did around Swedish investors. I think because we have a broader set of folks paying attention to our work, we're able to bring in a really broad set of folks. So we had investors, we had, city employees, county employees, and folks like our documenters, just average folks who are a little bit, maybe a little more civically engaged than the average person, but will come out for our events. And so to me, we got these two emails from folks who attended our event after, and one was, I believe housing is, and they represented the full spectrum that people can have, I think, around this issue. One from, I believe housing is a right. We shouldn't be able to make money off of providing housing to people. It should be a right to an investor, and both thanking us for making that space and intrigued with some ideas that came up in the session. So I really feel like making those kinds of spaces is a great thing that we can do, and that NNIP partners, folks who are interested in data, can come along and hear what people are saying in those spaces. I think NNIP partners have so much data skills that can be helpful, at least in our context. We don't have a ton of data capacity. It's kind of just me and different reporters who are, different reporters have different skill sets. So some of them have more quantitative skill sets and some of them have less. So in a scenario where there's less of that capacity with a media partner, being able to reach out to an NNIP partner, and even just as a thought partner when it comes to quantitative data, I think could make a big difference in that community. So what I'm talking about, I guess, is kind of an informal partnership, right? Like a thought partner, somebody you can just bring an issue to and talk it through. But I think even something really informal like that could be really helpful to a low data capacity media organization.
Yeah, so forming these connections where these community journalism outlets exist would be really helpful for the emerging space. Yeah, and I don't mean to say I can only speak about our scenario, our context. So there may be local media out there with really high data capacity, but in the instance where that's a bit of a void, if having that kind of thought partnership resource, I think, could be really helpful, and it can be mutually beneficial with that connection, that deeper connection to community. We hear all day, every day from all kinds of people calling, telling us what's important to them, telling us what they want us to know. And so having that kind of two-way communication, I think, could be helpful. Mm-hmm. Definitely. All right. Well, that's great information. Okay. Well, thank you, April. I'll stop the recording here.
All right. Thanks, Cole, for making that happen this morning from the lobby, even though you stole some of my moderator thunder. And appreciate the AV team getting that together, pulling that off perfectly. That was great. We're gonna.
Oh, that's nice.
All right.
It's true. People did clap. We're gonna do Q&A. We've got.
Great.
I'm not sure how much time, but someone will cut us off eventually. I think 20 minutes, something like that. For Q&A, it could be.
Oh, nice.
We have 30 minutes. We could talk about civic journalism, talk about collaborating with civic journalism,
Speculation.
talk about investor housing,
Great.
whatever you want.
I wish I could be that articulate when I'm well, not only when I was sick.
Yeah, she was sick.
You'll have to. Okay, thank you for that great presentation. April Urban right there was our colleague at the Poverty Center in Cleveland. So, and then hearing your experience in Detroit and the collaboration, I mean, the way she ended is illustrating how you collaborate as partners here in Detroit to address housing equity and housing quality issues. So thank you. My name is Francisca. I'm in Cleveland, in Detroit, at Case Western Reserve. The question I have is something, I mean, of course, we deal through very similar issues in Cleveland with so-called affordable housing, but really, it's housing that can expose children to lead. And my colleague up front, Mike Henderson, is working with others on a data dashboard that helps inform strategies in our county to address lead safe. When we embarked on trying to inform this strategy, we looked at case studies in Rochester and Detroit and tried to learn from you all. So I was just wondering if you could tell us the ways in which maybe data-driven Detroit has informed that process. I know it's a big challenge, right? Led in low-income housing that has not been upkept. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm not sure. I'm newer at Data-Driven Detroit. I know this project really well. I'm not sure I could do off the cuff a full history of all the ways we've been.
Erica can do
I don't know if Erica.
Hey, so I won't speak to Data-Driven Detroit exactly, but I know you've done a lot of coordination. So yeah, the lead work in Detroit has kind of been spaced out among Wayne State, the Public Health Department, a few other places. The speculation work that we did, I was at the University of Michigan. We put out a report in 2019 in which we looked specifically at speculator-owned housing and where it was purchased and how it was purchased. And what we found there was that any speculative owner with 10 or more properties who had purchased out of tax foreclosure, children living in those houses were 1.8 times more likely to have lead poisoning, right? So basically, thinking about those same principles, what does it mean when there's certain type of ownership in these places? What can we know about maintenance and other upkeep that happens? And most of the housing stock here is pre-79, so we've got lead everywhere. And then can we actually demonstrate that it has impacts on the community and in children in particular? What was done with that study? I mean, the health department liked it, didn't like it, but COVID happened, essentially. But the interesting thing about that underlying speculative data is it's really important. Sometimes we can miss the forest for the trees, and the power of that data is when you begin to actually attach it to these other quality of life indicators or what those experiences are. So we can start to know, we can know what that lead exposure is in children. We can know how much the city is spending on demolition, which on houses they could have stopped further up the chain, right? So in some ways it's like, how do we focus policies on pipelines that can be closed and other ways? Then how can we understand how these people are operating in this space and what kind of policy applications and implementations are there? In the case, you can bring in code enforcement data, right? And so you can start to think about what is it that you use, how can you have strategies for limited code enforcement and those pieces. And for those communities with like 311 data, you can also start to use that 311 data to understand what experiences are like in those households for these speculative owners. So there's all of those pieces there. But yeah, lead has been long-running and weirdly siloed, and yeah.
And I'll just add that from Data-Driven Detroit's perspective. So we work both with the City of Detroit Housing and Revitalization Department in recent years, but we also work with a sort of grassroots coalition, Get the Lead Out Detroit, so that we're kind of getting informed from that, like what do the policymakers need, and then also what do the people on the ground actually want and need in order to make change in the community. It's not perfect. Lead is hard, especially in an older city with such great disinvestment over many decades, but thank you, Joshua, for all of your hard work in the lead space and all the great academic work that you've done. You're an academic activist. We appreciate you, and we're mad at you for leaving. But anyways, thank you for keeping up the good work. So if we can talk later, I would love to talk more.
Hey, Ellie from LA. I see polls and surveys all the time saying that like trust in media as an institution broadly is at an all-time low. And I think, folks who are spreading disinformation are like also using quote unquote data all the time, right? And so I wonder if you feel like this kind of community-based journalism space is sort of immune to that, or if not, how you guys are navigating that.
Those local journalism is much more trusted than national media. So those same studies that show that the trust in media is falling, it's not that they're not true, that is true, but local media is more immune. Again, it's because you can gut check the narratives, the information with your own experience in a way that is much more difficult to do with national media. I think that the trust in local media and other institutions can be even more bolstered when you can even show that data at a more individual level and really allow people to, decide for themselves whether or not that thing is true or not true. And division is much more, I used to say that information gaps is where accountability goes to die and misinformation goes to breed. And that's completely true, right? So the more information that we can have, the better data that we can have, the more applicable we can make it to individuals, the better off we will be, not just in the media ecosystem, but like in communities.
Oh, I'll add quickly, my mic's not on, got cut off. The Edelman Trust Barometer is one of the main tools that we know, what institutions have trust. One of the strongest is the business community, and it makes me think a lot about, at least in Atlanta. So, it makes me think a lot about how do we then communicate what we're finding with our local chamber, our regional chamber, just to kind of have the word through those trusted sources. I think that is important.
In the Twin Cities, in the last less than a year of having clean single-family rental investor ownership data, we've already seen it be a really powerful tool in tenant organizing campaigns. Folks have been asking for this data for a long time, and communities are more organized when they feel like their questions are being answered. And so I'm interested in this part of how this data has played a role in building collective power. I think property level information is important, and it's great to equip folks with information on their property. But I'm thinking about the power dynamic of how much power does one tenant have when we're talking about corporations like BlackRock and their many shadow corporations. And we hear of frequent feelings of isolation for folks in single-family rentals. So I'm interested in what the tenant organizing space looks like in Detroit with this data, and how you see this maybe contributing to power building or collective movements here.
Well, I think we've had a lot harder of a time showing a picture of who owns what. And from what I think I read something in Minnesota, it was a lot clearer that there are big groups that own lots. It was a lot easier to show that picture. Yeah, we're struggling to put that together. A lot of properties are owned by just one-off LLCs, and so many of them. And so linking that, and that's part of what Joshua Akers' work at Property Praxis does is go through and make, in a pretty manual way, linking those back to kind of singular companies or owners to try and bring that picture together. But it's a tough picture to draw here. So sometimes I could say we don't really have that data set, at least. So so the second part of the question is kind of tough to answer, not knowing that first piece.
Just from some reporting that the tenant organizing space in Detroit, I think, is a lot more nascent than in other cities. We have noticed and we have reported on tenant organizing efforts that have really sprung up, I think really post-pandemic. But the other thing that has happened here in Detroit is that we transitioned from a majority homeowner city to a majority renter city pretty quickly, and I do believe that that's kind of part of what why we have a much more nascent tenants' rights kind of organizing here. But let me also say that I do think that individual level information is the basis of collective power. You cannot do a good job without it. Maybe because you have to spend your time organizing to get the information, right? Which is a real waste of time for people whose time is already so precious for. So I really do think that giving people good ownership information to allow them to then go decide what their other goals are and how they would want to meet that is really, really helpful. And definitely our job in the media, what people do with that information and how they want to organize around it is not our job, but we can definitely make it easier for people to meet their goals.
Oh, hi, Mark Abraham from New Haven. I have like a practical question for working with journalists. So many local journalists contact us often and we can give them data and talk through stories. And that's really helpful, but the main issue is there's so many news outlets and the turnover rate for young journalists is just so high. A lot of journalists only stay for a few months or a year at their outlet. So what are some ways you would suggest to sort of get to know journalists, to network with them, not wait for them to reach out to you, but be more proactive about maybe going to SPJ trainings or other events? Do you have any recommendations for that?
Would probably have. Do you have recommendations? I definitely have some. But.
No, our offices are next to each other. We pass each other in the hall constantly. We're not.
Yeah, I do. So my tips would be make these relationships at the editor level. Those are, those positions do change over less. If you want to really, if your goals are aligned, then it makes sense to really have the kind of relationship that we have where we're really kind of pushing on the same questions together. If you just want to be known as a data source, right, or you want to be available for people, then I do think it makes sending, what would in other ways kind of be like a press release just to everybody in your local media ecosystem and telling them what kind of information they could access through you. The kind of deeper relationship that we have, I think, is that we aren't just looking to you. We do use D3 as a source, but we're not looking to just use them as a source. We're really looking to use them as a collaborator and to be able to say this is data that we put ourselves behind, not saying D3 says, and giving ourselves that extra cover.
One of the issues that we've seen, it's similar, but it's not turnover, but it's the pace. So journalism works at a much faster pace than data stuff. And so it's the relationship at the executive level, I think, editor level has helped us out a lot because we can then share hey, we just did this, or we just posted something on social and show it to them, and we can drive what they're covering. So I know recently one of our local organizations just had a whole article about student homelessness, but it was because we shared some data that we just got from the Department of Education in Georgia, and we put the charts together and it kind of nicely packaged it for them. So we got to kind of drive what the news coverage was versus being responsive, which can kill, half a day to half a week, just getting back with the data request. And so trying to, that higher level relationship, but then also trying to keep, keep them pointed where you want them to be pointed. Sometimes it's helpful.
Great. I'm struck by Paul from St. Louis. I'm struck by these conversations of that are happening in the data space and in journalism and in academia around objectivity and responsiveness and what does the public care about? And so my question is, how do you view the role of community journalism or community data in a community change process? And particularly around who gets to set the agenda? And is that different for community journalism than it is larger media, corporate media? I'm just kind of curious about how you view your role in housing or otherwise in all the folks who are working to change community for the better.
I'd say for our part, well, I'll speak for myself specifically because it's not true about my organization necessarily, but I see myself as I know a lot about how to do different types of analyses, how to use the different technologies, and I'm very much a data expert, and I rely on our partners for that subject matter expertise and to kind of understand why they're asking the questions, what they're driving for, and I'm trying to listen very carefully to respond with my work as closely as I can to what it is they'd like to like to ask and why and all of that. So I do have folks in my organization who are very much subject matter expertise. When you do this for long enough, it kind of comes along. But for me, that's how I tend to think about it, where I'm really listening very carefully to the people who I'm working with and really listening for them to kind of guide what it is I'm going to do, which I'm going to do something technical, but mostly it's trying to be really responsive to like what they're asking about or concerned about.
I think that all news organizations will kind of tell you what it is that they think they're doing, and you should really pay attention to that, and you should believe them, because, you know, for us, there's also a great, I don't know, this isn't like necessarily the journalism nerd room, but there's a great book called The View from Somewhere by Lewis Raven Wallace, also a Michigander, and that's a great book about objectivity and kind of the how people work through that, and to what degree those conversations can be very helpful, and to what degree those conversations are really about suppressing certain people's voices. At Outlier, we're very clear that what we hope for is a more liberated city, and we are really pushing for self-determination for Detroiters. We are not a movement journalism shop. There are those organizations that really align themselves with certain, you know, kind of certain movements, workers' rights, racial justice. That's definitely not where we are. I think we're more kind of like by the book. But what we want to do is use information to serve Detroiters and have them decide what their goals are. And like I said, we do use data to find where the information and accountability gaps are, and then that's how we align our coverage areas. So we cover housing, transportation, city and county government. We also have a documenters program, and utilities. So, you know, it is a shifting landscape, and I think that before you work with any journalist or any news organization, a piece of advice would be to ask the journalist where they're approaching these issues from, and to also look and find out where the news organization is approaching these issues from, and like what their dedication to following these, because like you said, like the pace of journalism is very fast, it's under-resourced, so before you put a lot of your time into building a relationship with a reporter or a newsroom, you really should ask like what their commitment is to this issue, and how steady that commitment is.
In Atlanta Civic Circle covers housing, labor, and democracy, and one of the things we wanted to help them do is measure, like, or figure out, like, define democracy. It's one of those words we use so much and don't think so much about, especially at the local level. And so we had this idea of like, let's create a local democracy index, and a lot of that would be informed by the trust data that Ellie mentioned that we think a whole lot about, and especially this group. And so we had a community focus group to really understand, like, what do you think about all of this? And it turns out it's like a really interesting idea that would be like not useful at all to anyone, because they didn't care, and they're like, that's not what we need as an organizing tool. And so I think it was like really helpful. This is like 2 Fridays ago. It was like really helpful for us. We were like, okay, well, we're not sure what to do next, but it isn't this. So that was just like an academic exercise for ourselves. But really, like, how do we help community organizers and community leaders have information that they can use to keep their local government accountable? That's more useful. I think it's a bit harder, but like, that's like on us to kind of figure out now or keep working with. But I think you mentioned like to inform, you know, community change, like you have to talk to them. Like it has to be an open dialogue, because we're glad we did it early before we completely ran with it. But
Luke from Boston. I've been trying to formulate a question from almost the middle of the discussion before we got to Q&A. And I think some of the discussion in the Q&A is already helping me think about it. But the question, it's kind of two-part. Like, one was I was realizing I didn't know what you all meant by civic journalism, because I thought, like, isn't all journalism civic? But I think, am I right? I guess there you're thinking of it as citizen-created journalism or participatory journalism. Is that how you guys mean the term, or is it just journalism generally?
You're the journalist.
Well, yeah, but I don't ever use the word civic journalism, but I was happy to roll with it. Like,
Don't overthink it.
It's another thing we did in focus group.
I mean, I do think that local journalism can be extremely valuable, even if it isn't necessarily aimed at creating a healthier civic space intentionally, but I think that there are now a lot of models of like service journalism. That's kind of the framework that we use, like service journalism, meaning it's more responsive, and it is definitely oriented towards trying to help people achieve their own goals. That's like usually the frame that I use, but
Yeah, we had a working definition when we were developing this panel around, local coverage that hits social issues more deeply than a lot of, when you think of local news, TV news, you often think of just crime coverage, but being a little more, I think about like moving towards solutions, so solutions-based journalism, think more about nonprofit journalism. So like our local paper has one staff writer, but it's still owned by this giant corporation, and they just surface level hit up like whatever the press releases that come in are. I think civic journalism or civic nonprofit or whatever we're going to call it goes more deeply into more complex issues and probably does try to better represent kind of the lived experience of those neighborhoods.
That's helpful. And, is this on? There we go. The other piece of it that I was thinking about is just even the notion of like a nonprofit, a private organization like ours, partnering with media. On our end, kind of love that idea because any partnership with media is a chance to amplify our work. But in the reverse, I kind of would expect to be more skeptical of the nonprofit. Like ask us the tough questions. And I've noticed in my time doing this work, and it probably relates to what Mark was saying, and I think you just said it too, Tommy, like a big factor is just less well-staffed newsrooms with younger, staffers who are on the ground just running with the press release you send them, but like we get less skeptical questions than we ever did in the past. It's kind of beneficial to us, but it doesn't feel like that's the way journalism should actually work. Like nonprofit releases a report, you should ask us some tough questions about the assumptions or what conclusions we're drawing from the data.
I had this idea recently, it's probably isn't the space to pitch ideas, but on election night, the CNN and MSNBC, they had the guy with the tie and the rolled up sleeves that's always looking at maps, and it was
Steve Kornacki.
Yeah, I wanted to offer to our local news, like you could have 2 minutes of that every week, we could help you out, but I don't know if that, I don't know if that helps anything, it just does sound like a fun idea.
Hi, thank you so much for the panel. I'm thinking about narrative and who decides the narrative of how you're representing the data, because we all know that negative stories get more attention. So I guess my question is, how do you measure success and when developing a story, and who do you bring in when thinking about that narrative? Because community should have a voice in what is reported out, and maybe they do. I'm just wondering about the narrative piece.
I mean, there are many functions of journalism, and one of them is, narrative shift, and one of them is, just to kind of create a record. When we do our work, again, we are going off of an information needs survey that tells us where people's information and accountability gaps are. And for us, that means that the narrative piece is kind of less important. Every story has its own narrative, but the narrative, what we're trying to get to is just actually really aligning the narrative that maybe policymakers or officials have with the reality of what people really want from them. So I do think that reporters in particular from national outlets lead with narratives about cities like Detroit in ways that we find often objectionable and harmful and super annoying. But we are local media, and that is less of an issue here. Of course, I think with crime that is like very different. Those stories often do create a very harmful narrative in ways that should be considered more carefully. But a lot of the local coverage, if you look at that, the narrative is more aligned to the reality in a certain place. But you know what, there's a good example, actually, we've been thinking about this. So we have a story coming out tomorrow, because we did some work with D3 on what the rental landscape versus ownership landscape looked like in Detroit, and found that rentals were increasing. Then the census came out with new numbers that showed like there are more owner-occupied units in Detroit than than for many, many years, right? Like, and we are now again a majority owner city. We don't think that's true. We think that the data that we did with D3 is better. And those kind of narratives are incredibly important, and data is so important in those narratives because people do believe it, right? And when it reinforces something that particularly policymakers want to hear, it's going to get a power of its own. So I do think that like the quality of the data and the partnerships between news organizations and data organizations can go a long way with making sure that the narrative that news organizations are saying is actually reflecting the truth.
And I think Aaron put, Sarah's kind of like Aaron was writing about it, and he did sum that up so well. As far as like, hey, because what it was, I think it was in the Free Press, they just picked up the census number, and it's a lot more complicated. Detroit is just, from a housing perspective, a lot different than a lot of the rest of the country, so there's a lot of reasons why that doesn't exactly make sense to just report it like that here, and I think you did a really good job just getting to that point clearly without getting too deep into the weeds.
Great, we have time for one last question.
So I'm curious to pick up, when I work with data in communities, I've coined what I call the 4 stages of data grieving, which is that when I see data, the first thing I say is, where did you get that? You did it wrong. That's not mine. Okay, now we can talk. So as a journalist, or Mike, as a data guy, how do you interact with, just to use your example, census says Detroit is majority owned. You say it's not. You did it wrong. Where did you get that? That's not mine. So how do you get over no matter what the data is, or especially when data is in conflict, how do you talk the community through that?
Well, I can talk through the first couple because it's like, oh yeah, I probably did that wrong. It's right there at the top. I think at least with specifically census and specifically that issue, it's maybe I'm a little bit more like, hey, I'm sure there's a ton of ways to look at this, but this is 2 sentences saying, hey, everyone, majority ownership again, which is like, okay. Any claim like that, I'm immediately like, okay, no, there's a lot of detail here that's being left out. But yeah, as far as going beyond that, I mean, usually the difficult portion is talking through, like you have to make many, many decisions, and it's when you're looking at some of these data sets and just making sure you're really clear about enumerating those. I mean, this is gonna be a very technical answer from like my process, but like, to yourself, within your own work, keep very careful track of like, I'm making a decision here, I'm making a decision here, making notes in your code if you're writing code. Like, trying to like carry that thought process through, so then when you get to the end, you can try and walk someone else through that. And then it's really helpful to rely on really effective communicators to help you get that and frame that well and get that out to people. So yeah.
I think that for us, it is like I said, we're a little tough because we have so many questions and we don't necessarily have the expertise to take a very easy answer, but we always really want to know about methods, right? So the reason why I knew that D3's data was better than the census data when it comes to this question is because we had gone through the methods when we went through that report before, and I felt really confident about them. It is a burden on D3 because they need to explain it to me, who's not a data expert, but again, I think that process is like super helpful for both of us because it really does put you through that you know, it's very rigorous when you have to explain something to a non-expert and a very skeptical non-expert. Yeah.
I don't think it's very useful actually to just be very clear on when you're delivering it, you know, because the different folks you work with, you don't always have someone who's going to say like, okay, you answered my one question, here's 20, you know, but it's great to turn it over that much and to think really carefully about your work has been really useful, and just, you know, getting better at delivering this type of project. So no, I'm all for it.
Well, thank you both, and we hope April feels better. That's it.